you so much, Mary Kim, for that wonderful introduction, and for everybody coming and powering through the less than one-third energy slump. And for another talk, I really appreciate everyone's presence here. So I'm just going to give a little talk that goes over what my fellowship work was, and then because just talking about a concert we put on and what went into it isn't the most useful information, I'm also going to give just a quick little crash course on some 19th century New Orleans music history that I think is empowering to lots of people, even outside of the music discipline. So I've been enjoying starting these talks with two different quotes on art making in the context of social justice and reflecting issues of social justice. So this first one's by one of my favorite poets, George Oppen, who I hope lots of the writing students know, and anyone who doesn't know them, please check them out. So I'll just go ahead and read it. I think the question asked more frankly would be, is it more important to produce art or to take political action? Of course, I cannot pretend to answer such a question. I could point this out, however, that art and political action are in precise opposition in this regard, that it can always be quite easily shown that political action is going to be valuable. It is difficult to ever prove that political action has been valuable, whereas art is precisely the opposite case. It seems always impossible to prove that it is going to be valuable, and yet it is always quite clear that the art of the past has been of great value to humanity. I offer it only as a suggestion that art lacks in political action, not action. One does what he is most moved to do. And that's from his personal daybooks. This wasn't intended to be published, really. I think this is particularly interesting for all of us to consider right now, given that many of us in our practices are starting to accept an absence of future. Most of us writing, at least in the music department, I don't feel like many of us are thinking about how our stuff's going to be received in 100 years. It's also particularly interesting given that Oppen was a political activist himself who abandoned poetry for his activism and then came back to it. My second quote is a paraphrase from a public talk that the great playwright Erica Dickerson Dispenza gave in New Orleans as part of a festival called No Dream Deferred that was highlighting contemporary Black playwrights. So this is not an exact quote. So she was asked by an audience member how she approaches writing about trauma, because so much of her work deals with extremely heavy topics such as Hurricane Katrina, sexual abuse, Flint, Michigan, water crisis, things of this nature. And I thought her response was beautiful. She said, the work is not heavy. It's heavy because you have not dealt with that issue. You have not dealt with that issue or event, so it seems heavy to you. For me, I just tell the truth, and that is not divorced from our struggle. And I love that because so often when we're listening or experiencing challenging art, there's this idea of like, oh, you're writing about trauma, you're just performing whatever the tragedy you've experienced is. And I just love that comeback to that. So now we can all be armed with that. Any of the East Coasters, please keep your eye out for Dickerson Dispenza. She's routinely staged in New York and is an incredible playwright. So that brings me to what our work was. With the fellowship, I run an ensemble back home in New Orleans called Alluvium Ensemble. We're a kind of loose-knit organization that's just basically trying to pool our resources in order to present music that all of us are passionate about to the public. All of our artistic directors are born and raised in New Orleans, and altogether we span about five generations of New Orleans artists. So there's this cross-generational exchange that's really special, and a lot of what that invites is archival work. So with this project, we were trying to examine the pedagogical through lines of our practices and how they birthed all of us as performers. So we took one of our ensemble members, Roger Dickerson, who today is 90 years old and still with us, fortunately. He's seen so much of the arc of 20th century history progress and is one of our most prolific educators. So through his output as a general lens, we crafted a program of music that spans the 20th century, highlighting this idea of pedagogy forming historical narrative rather than just great works or whatever. Instead, it was this constant exchange. So we also programmed a rather famous composer, Moses Hogan, who died tragically young of glioblastoma in, I believe, 2001. But he was a student of Roger Dickerson. Moses Hogan's largely known as rebirthing the American spiritual tradition in the 90s and 80s and things. So it was really special to be able to reconnect him from past the grave with his mentor who outlived him in new arrangements. And the featured solos for that, Tyrone Chambers, he was one of Moses Hogan's final proteges. So getting to connect these lines across death and across time, it's one of my favorite things about notated classical music. We're able to constantly stay engaged with artists who are no longer with us and continue learning from them, but also continuing to shape the context in which their work exists in. So we presented that at the New Orleans the Historic New Orleans Collection, which is an archive. So a lot of what we discussed in the last social justice online meeting, which I hope some of you were at, was how do we work within and against archives, and that was something we came up against very quickly, because when we got the gig, it was like, okay, great, they can house a bunch of these scores that only exist in a woman's attic in New Orleans and could disappear at any given time with one bad storm. And then we very quickly discovered that they want to lock things away about certain copyrights, they want to create new copyrights and all this. So then that kind of led us to the second stage of this project, which is considering ways that we can archive that isn't about just taking something and putting it in a museum, but digitizing it and distributing it more fully. So I don't want to spend too long on that. That's our project. Here's a tiny bit from one of the, oh wait, no, that's just a photo. So here's Roger Dickerson, and this is Tyrone, our soloist. And then on the left over here, we've got Tyrone and Chris Trapani, who's another local composer and was also a soloist on the program. Okay, that's fine. So I was gonna have like a little 30 seconds of one of the pieces that we performed called For the Love of Jesus by Roger Dickerson, which is an homage to a 19th century Creole nun named Henriette de Lille, who was very historically significant in that she denied the passage system, which was a system in which you would essentially, instead of being officially an enslaved person, you would become a domestic house servant of a white lord, and then you were occupied this awkward space between a person of color and not. She said, no, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to become a nun. And then she created one of the first educational institutions for the formerly enslaved in New Orleans, which still exists today. So that was a really fun piece to stage and to get to go through. So yeah, I just talked about that a little bit, about Alluvium Ensemble, just this idea of creating a network of mutual aid and historical exchange in order to help us better understand who we all are as artists, and also to help arm us for things like this when we're abroad. How do we talk about our art, and how do we talk about it in meaningful ways that will hopefully be informative and connecting outside of our little insular community that is New Orleans. So now, I'm going to see how quickly I can get through this. So very brief history of mostly 19th century New Orleans music. So the important backdrop is that where New Orleans has always been a trading port back to pre-colonial times. The exact location would kind of move with the river as it would change the land around it, but primarily Choctaw had a firm institution there that was a trading port. So there was already this rich cultural exchange going on even before the colonial era. And then tying it into classical music, one of the first times New World music would find its way into Europe was in 1725, when a group of Delta chiefs went to France and actually performed for the court of, I think it was the Sun King, whoever was King of France in 1725. And Jean-Philippe Rameau was in the audience, and he was so struck with this music that he wrote a full opera on it called Les Sauvages. That title. But yeah, I love that highlighting that the exchange has been both sides the whole time. It's not like colonists just came here or came there and bam, music happened. So then moving forward, in 1796, we premiered the first opera in North America, Sylvain by André Detry. We often think of opera starting in North America as in New York. It's not the case. We were doing many operas in New Orleans long before they were doing them in New York, including a lot of mainstream staples of the repertoire. So Congo Square is very important to our musical history. On Sundays, under what was known as the Code Noir, which was the French rules that dictated the treatment of enslaved people, no one was allowed to work on Sundays. So, and that wasn't always the case, but that was what it was on the books. So then when the enslaved people had their day off on Sunday, they would go to Congo Square, and this is where that mixing of the African diaspora with the colonial music, such as Spanish marching music and then French formal music, really starts to happen. It's at Congo Square, which today is Armstrong Park, named for Louis Armstrong, and the home of Mahalia Jackson Theater. So in 1840, Victor Eugene McCarty becomes the first person of color to enter the Paris Conservatoire. He partially wanted to leave New Orleans to go somewhere that had a more navigable racial dynamic. It's important to note that as we march towards America in New Orleans, the racial situation gets worse and worse and worse. Under the French, there was lots of different classifications of racial identity, most clearly people of color, black people, Creoles, and then Passe Blanc Creoles, I guess four, which are white passing Creole people, and then white people. And then all of that stuff kind of just, and Irish, and then all of that, and Italians. You know how complicated it is, but all of that just gets more and more, for lack of better words, black and white as we march into the United States. Victor Eugene McCarty is also hugely interesting because he was a senator during Reconstruction. So the Philharmonic Society was our mainstay throughout the 19th century, founded by Samuel Sneyer. It was the orchestra that accompanied all of our operas. Now, what I find so fascinating about the Philharmonic Society is that it was always integrated in a way to where they wouldn't have even considered it integrated back then, because it was just what the milieu was. And so it had both people who were very much cut and dry black people, most of whom had been granted freedom, because back then you could win freedom or purchase yourself from your captor, and then you literally had to carry around a piece of paper that declared you a free person. So there were people like that playing in this orchestra alongside high society Creoles and just run-of-the-mill white people. It was about 20% what we would consider white and 80% what would now be considered people of color. And I just find that's so fascinating and important to our narrative of high art in this continent. It has always been something that has been, at least in New Orleans, widespread and across many different sectors of society. So Edmond Dede, perhaps our most famous composer out of New Orleans, sets this precedent of just get out, just leave. So he was really successful, came from a pretty affluent family, went to France, had a long career performing. Ernest Guiraud, he taught at the Paris Conservatoire for a long time. He actually taught Debussy. And there's some stories about Debussy being inspired by Guiraud's accounts of Congo Square music, particularly the bamboula, which is a dance. Gottschalk, can't mention classical music in New Orleans without mentioning Gottschalk. He was one of the first internationally touring concert pianists out of North America. He died on stage in Brazil while playing a piece called Muerte. And that's just pretty metal. Also, one of my favorite people in music history, Basil Beret. He's the only person that I'm aware of to have published while an enslaved person. He was eventually granted his freedom. He has volumes of piano music. What I find so fascinating about him is if a regular person listens to him, they might hear this kind of Scott Joplin-esque ragtime sound. But this was developing simultaneously on the other side of the country with very limited exchange. So I just think that's really interesting because there's always this idea of where's the ragtimey sound come from in trad jazz, and this kind of throws a lot of dirt into that conversation and makes it way harder to have. Before I go to that, another thing about Beret that I think is perfectly encapsulated in him is there's often this thing which is why does early jazz music sound French? And now an easy answer is because New Orleans is French. But it's not that simple. So the Creole class, the high Creole class, were tied into the French aristocracy. They were in many cases, part of the French aristocracy. So there were imports of textbooks from France to the New World in New Orleans, and then these Creole educators used these same textbooks to educate what would become the proto-jazz generation. So a little bit earlier than we think, Buddy Bolden is the bookend of that. But then of course the influence you can still see spread all through. So it's again this parallel development. It's not that that Louis Armstrong sounds like Debussy. It's that they're coming out of a very similar educational milieu, and then they sound very different because of the extreme differences in those individual milieus. But there's this through line of harmony that gets complicated in both of their individual lives and in both of their community lives. So I love telling this narrative, and I'm giving y'all this because it's something that we don't see very often talked about when we talk about the history of classical music in particular in North America. And I really am just like, why? And so why? When, like I was talking about this March Church mark, we needed to eliminate racial complexity. We needed to eliminate racial groups and create just set divisions. So that's a huge thing that comes with the end of the Code Noir. Another huge thing that can't be ignored is, of course, the Native American genocide, which played a really huge role in Creole society in particular. I mean, Jonathan Jackson has an awesome video on American masking Indian traditions in New Orleans. That's a whole nother talk. But that contributes to it. Chattel slavery and sharecropping made it really, obviously there's incentive to dehumanize and delegitimize the art of people when you're trying to advocate for their enslavement. American nationalism, we didn't want to talk about the French influence or the Spanish influence or the West African influence or the Native influence because it's America, and this is American music. And then with Reconstruction, we had this closed opportunity that was stamped out, and I think that's really exemplified in Victor Eugene McCarty. And then there was and is a concerted effort at erasure of this historical narrative and of these documents. While not from New Orleans or having to do much with North American music, the very famous European composer Joseph Bellone, also known as Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who had a feature film out recently about him, he was the most famous composer in Europe within his lifetime. When Napoleon decided to reinstitute the transatlantic slave trade, there's a documented effort to destroy this music. He straight up just burned all of it and wrote about how he needed to do that to justify the transatlantic slave trade. So how could we sell to our people that these people can be sold when one of the greatest artists of our time is a black man? That's a really cut and dry example. American academia and the racialization of improvisation is another huge one because we want to have it as just there's the improvisation that African Americans do, and then there's our notated formal music that white people do, and there's no in between, which any musician knows is not really how it works. And then, of course, we want to have a convenient historical narrative about the birth of our national music of jazz. With Buddy Bolden, he was insane and in an insane asylum, and then he took a horn and invented jazz, and now we have Wynton Marsalis. And that is just, textbook magical Negro fallacy, and you see it all the time from both well-meaning people and not so well-meaning people. So that's my talk.